My sister didn't just steal my fiancé. She stole the boutique my grandmother built with her own hands, the apartment above it where I used to fall asleep over sketches and fabric swatches, and the version of me my family used to trust. While my mother was still sedated after surgery, Naomi slid papers under my hand and called it a favor. By the next morning she had my ring, my ex, and 35% of the store. By that night I had a duffel bag, no key, and a family explaining to me why I needed to calm down. I disappeared for 4 years because survival came before revenge. That's the part people never understand when they talk about stories like this. The strongest revenge is rarely loud at the beginning. It looks like silence. It looks like a woman getting through the week. It looks like somebody learning how ownership works after being pushed out of the thing she built. 4 years later, I walked back into Evelyn Lane, with the store deed in my bag, the defaulted loan in my company's name, and every original design file they thought they had buried under new labels and polished photos. Naomi and Andrew had spent years acting like they'd won because they got there first. What they forgot was simple. Possession isn't ownership. And the woman they locked out had finally come back holding the paper that decided whose name belonged on the door. Stay with me. Because the kiss wasn't the part that nearly ruined me. The part that nearly ruined me was what they got me to sign after it. And the part that saved me wasn't anger. It was the paper they forgot to fix. My grandmother Evelyn opened that boutique with one industrial machine, a folding table, and a rule she never bent for anybody. Pretty could get you in the door. It could not run the back room. She started out doing alterations for church women and prom girls, then mothers of brides. Then brides themselves, and then the kind of women who wanted something made right because they were tired of buying things that almost fit. By the time I was old enough to sit still on a stool and sort buttons by color, the store already smelled like steam, cedar hangers, starch, and whatever coffee my grandmother had reheated too many times that morning. Most kids remember a house. I remember a work table. I remember my grandmother's glasses sliding down her nose while she pinned a hem and talked to me like I was old enough to understand every word. I remember learning that there was a difference between silk and satin, between beautiful and expensive, between a woman wanting to be seen and a woman wanting to disappear in something flattering. My grandmother could tell the difference in 3 seconds. She said good work started with paying attention. And most people failed because they were too busy performing themselves to notice the truth in front of them. Naomi was good at performing herself. That sounds cruel, but it isn't. It's just accurate. She was 3 years younger than me, prettier in the easy way people reward funny, when she wanted to be, and gifted with that bright social instinct that makes strangers feel chosen. Even when we were kids, people used words like light around her. They said, she made a room feel happy. Nobody used words like that for me. For me it was dependable, capable, serious. The one Evelyn could trust with the register. The one who stayed late. The one who knew where the pearl buttons were, which bride hated strapless, which mother needed the invoice itemized because she was fighting with her ex-husband over who had to pay for what. Naomi could float through the front of the store and make customers laugh. I knew what kept the lights on. That became the pattern of our family long before any man got involved. My mother loved us both, but she loved peace more than precision. That sounds softer than it was. What it meant in practice was that whoever made conflict feel the ugliest, usually lost. Naomi learned that early. I learned it slowly, and by the time I understood it, it had already become a system. If Naomi forgot something, she was overwhelmed. If I objected to something, I was intense. If Naomi charmed a customer, she was a natural. If I corrected a contract, I was rigid. My grandmother saw it, though. She never let Naomi handle the books. And Naomi hated that in the careless way beautiful people hate being told no. Not enough to work harder. Just enough to complain about being underestimated. When I was 22, Evelyn started letting me sit in on vendor calls. When I was 24, she handed me the redesign plan for the store website and told me to stop asking permission for ideas that were already better than the old way. By 26, I'd taken Evelyn Lane from being a beloved neighborhood boutique to something that had a real waitlist, trunk shows with regional designers and a private client list of women who flew in twice a year because they trusted our fit. My grandmother did not hand me that out of pity. She handed it to me because I had earned it in the back room where nobody was clapping. That mattered later. It mattered more than almost anything. After my grandmother died, the grief in the family was strange and uneven. My mother cried hard for 6 weeks, then started speaking about Evelyn like a museum label. Naomi cried in public, and posted beautifully written captions, and took flowers to the cemetery, in a beige coat that made her look like she'd been styled by grief itself. I couldn't do any of that. I went back to work. That was the only place she still felt near me. Before she died, my grandmother had structured things in a way nobody in the family fully appreciated except me. The business itself, Evelyn Lane, was one entity. The building and the apartment above it were another. The trademark had been filed in my name during the rebrand, because Evelyn said if I was the one building the next version of the store, my name needed to be on the thing that made it recognizable. At the time, Naomi rolled her eyes and said Grandma was acting like this was a law firm. My grandmother didn't even look up from the contract. She said, "No, sweetheart. I'm acting like people change when there's money." I owned 65% of the operating company after Evelyn died. My mother held the other 35. The building sat in a separate real estate company with my mother as managing member after the estate closed, but the structure was clear, and so were the lease terms. I understood every page. Naomi understood the pictures on the mood board and the opening night Prosecco budget. That also mattered later. About a year after the funeral, I met Andrew. He came in for a tux fitting for a charity event, and he was the sort of man women are trained to read as safe before they've gathered enough facts to know better. Clean haircut, good watch but not flashy, calm voice. The kind of polite that lets you imagine depth where there might just be control. He noticed details. That was his first appeal. Most men treated the boutique like a place where women made decisions that men had to endure. Andrew asked questions about cut timing, margins, event seasons, customer flow. He worked in commercial lending then, and he liked business models. He said Evelyn Lane was one of the few boutiques he'd seen that actually understood recurring relationships instead of chasing one-time foot traffic. I should have heard the danger in that. Back then, I heard respect. He started taking me to dinner after close. He brought soup when I was sick during market week. He listened when I talked about sourcing and cash flow, and how hard it was to grow something without turning it into the wrong version of itself. He seemed to understand that the boutique wasn't a hobby. It was my life's architecture. That's another thing people don't get when they simplify stories like mine into "your sister stole your man." A man can betray you and still not be the deepest wound in the room. Andrew wasn't the deepest wound. He was just the tool that made the rest of it possible. He proposed in the apartment above the boutique on a rainy Tuesday night with takeout containers still on the table and half-finished sketches spread across the couch. He used my grandmother's diamond because my mother said Evelyn would have wanted it kept in the family, and at the time I believed that meant something honorable. Naomi cried when I told her. She hugged me too hard and said she was so happy she could barely breathe. When I look back now, I don't rewrite everything as fake. That's lazy. Naomi probably was happy in that moment. She liked being near other people's good news almost as much as she liked stepping into it once it had enough glow. For a while everything looked fine. Andrew got closer to the business because I let him. He said if we were building a future together, I needed somebody who could help me think bigger. He wasn't wrong about that part. The problem was that his version of bigger always seemed to require moving control away from the people who had actually built the thing. He talked about expansion. He talked about financing a second-floor renovation and adding ready-to-wear capsules. He talked my mother into believing the boutique was leaving money on the table by staying intimate and careful. He talked Naomi into believing she had an eye for branding because she could pick fonts and flatter women in fitting rooms. And because I was already exhausted because grief had made me more practical and less suspicious because it never occurred to me that I was living inside the setup for my own erasure, I kept thinking I could slow the whole thing down. Later, that was my mistake. Not trusting them. Trusting that time was still mine. My mother's surgery got scheduled for the same week as my bridal shower because the doctor had an opening and she'd already postponed it twice. It wasn't life-threatening. It was one of those procedures that sounds manageable when you explain it over the phone and suddenly becomes huge when you see your mother in a hospital gown stripped down to vulnerability making jokes too brightly because she's scared. I was handling fittings, final wedding details, post-op logistics, and one last round of lender conversations. Andrew had insisted we needed to keep warm if we wanted flexibility after the wedding. Naomi volunteered to help with everything. That should have made me grateful. Instead, it made me tired in a way I didn't know how to name. She kept showing up with solutions I hadn't asked for. She answered emails that should have come to me. She hosted consultations I thought had been rescheduled. She referred to the boutique as ours in front of customers with this airy confidence that made correcting her feel small and ugly. Once 3 days before the bridal shower, I told my grandmother's old head seamstress, Rosa, that I felt like I was watching somebody rest their hand on the edge of my life and slowly test how much of it they could pull toward themselves without me making a scene. Rosa looked at me for a long second and said, "Then don't wait too long to make one." I laughed. That was another mistake. By the morning of my bridal shower, I thought the most fragile thing in my life was my mother's recovery. I had no idea it was my name on everything I thought was safe. The bridal shower was at the apartment above the boutique. My mother was still in the hospital, drifting in and out of sleep, annoyed at missing it, telling me to take pictures and not let Naomi overdo the mimosas because she got too loud when she was hostessing. Women I'd known since high school filled the apartment with tissue paper and perfume and soft little exclamations over ribbon and flowers and all the other things people use to dress up the idea that a woman's life is about to begin. My life had already begun. That apartment and that store were where it had happened. That's why the humiliation landed as deep as it did. Not because the bridal shower was sacred, because it was mine. I went into the pantry off the back hallway looking for the extra champagne flutes Naomi said she'd put there. The light was off. I reached for the switch and heard breathing before I saw anything. Then I saw my sister with both hands on Andrew's face. I saw him leaning into her like he had done it before. And I saw the exact half second when Naomi realized I was standing there and chose not shame, not panic, not even apology. Calculation. That was the first moment I understood how dangerous she really was. She stepped back first. Andrew turned second. Nobody rushed toward me. Nobody lied quickly enough to be convincing. That's how I know it wasn't new. People only scramble when they still think the truth can be managed. Naomi was the one who spoke. "Claire," she said in the same voice you'd use if somebody spilled something expensive. "Please don't do this in front of everybody." That sentence changed me. Not because of the affair. Because of the frame. I was the risk. I was the mess. I was the one being asked to contain myself while they stood there with my life still warm on their mouths. Andrew tried next. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." He actually said that. Like there had been a better version waiting. Like betrayal only becomes offensive once the timing is inconvenient. I don't remember throwing the flute I was holding, but I remember the sound it made against the wall. I remember Naomi flinching backward, and then immediately recovering into concern as if my anger were proof of her innocence. She reached toward me. I moved away. She said, "You've been under so much pressure." Andrew said my name like I was the one who needed to come back to the facts. And I remember looking from one face to the other, and realizing something worse than the kiss. They were already on the same side of the conversation. Not guilty. Aligned. The women in the living room heard enough noise to go quiet. Somebody called my name from down the hall. Naomi lowered her voice and said, "If you blow up like this, now your mother's going to hear about it before she wakes up." That was the second moment I understood her. She wasn't trying to deny what I had seen. She was moving immediately to consequences. To optics. To whoever could be positioned as the problem first. I left the apartment before anybody could crowd the hallway and make me explain my own humiliation in real time. I drove to the hospital, with my makeup half ruined, and my stomach twisting so hard, I thought I might throw up in the parking garage. My mother was asleep when I got there. The room smelled like antiseptic and reheated broth and those flowers people send when they don't know what else to do. I sat in the plastic chair beside her bed and stared at the rail until my hands stopped shaking. That should have been the point where I called off the wedding, called a lawyer, called every truth by its right name. Instead, I did what women like me are trained to do when the floor disappears. I stayed useful. Andrew texted first. He said he was sorry. That we needed to talk privately, that he didn't want the business dragged into something personal. Naomi texted second. She said the lender packet still needed a signature, because my mother couldn't sit up long enough to review it, and if we missed the timing, the vendor terms Andrew had negotiated might fall apart. She said she knew this was a terrible day. She said she was trying to keep things from getting worse. Trying to keep things from getting worse. That sentence still makes my throat go cold. She came to the hospital in a cream sweater like she was auditioning for the role of worried daughter. She sat on the edge of the chair beside me, and spoke softly because my mother was sleeping. She said we didn't have to solve anything personal that day. She said we just needed temporary voting coverage, so the boutique wouldn't look unstable while I took a few days to breathe. She said Andrew had already looped the attorney in. She said all I had to do was sign the emergency ops packet, so we didn't scare vendors or customers. I read the top page. I did not read the rest well enough. That is the truth I had to live with. I wasn't drugged. I wasn't unconscious. I was shattered, sleep-deprived, and making decisions in the blast radius of public betrayal, while my mother lay 10 feet away on pain medication, and Naomi spoke in the calm, practiced voice of someone handling a fragile person for everybody's good. The packet transferred 35% of my ownership to Naomi and amended voting control in ways that only looked temporary if you wanted them to. She told me it was coverage. It was a takeover. I signed. When I think about it now, I don't call myself stupid. I call that what it was. Fraud delivered in the tone of family management. My mother woke halfway through and asked if everything was okay. Naomi leaned over and kissed her forehead and said yes. We were just making sure the store stayed protected while she recovered. My mother nodded and drifted again. I've replayed that image more times than I can count. Not because my mother betrayed me in that exact second. Because that was the second the whole lie got blessed, by exhaustion, by timing, by the natural authority people hand to the person who looks least upset. By that night, Andrew had stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. He came to the apartment with a face I'd never seen before. Controlled, legal, already elsewhere. He said the wedding obviously wasn't happening. He said he and Naomi hadn't meant to hurt me. He said feelings had changed over time. He said the boutique needed stability, and given the way the day had gone, it might be better for everybody if I stepped back for a while. I laughed at that. I actually laughed. I asked him if he understood what his face looked like when he used business language to describe stealing somebody's life. He didn't answer. Naomi appeared in the hallway behind him wearing my grandmother's diamond. Not on a chain, not tucked in a box. On her hand. I think that was the exact moment the grief split open and showed me the wound beneath it. A man leaving can humiliate you. A sister putting on your grandmother's diamond while the man who proposed with it stands in your doorway and suggests a cooling-off period does something else. It doesn't just hurt. It rewrites the blood inside the hurt. I told her to take it off. She looked at her hand, then back at me. She said, maybe Grandma was trying to tell us something. That was the ugliest thing anybody has ever said to me in a quiet voice. I moved toward her. Andrew stepped between us. And there it was. The full architecture. He wasn't torn. He wasn't confused. He was protecting her. My mother came home 2 days later to a story that had already been shaped for her. Naomi told her Andrew, and I had been drifting for months. Andrew told her I'd signed the transfer because I knew I needed rest and didn't want to manage the store in an emotional state. My mother, recovering and tired and desperate not to believe her family had become that kind of family, accepted the version that required the least moral courage from everybody involved. When I said the documents had been misrepresented, Naomi looked wounded. When I said the ring belonged back with me, until everything else was sorted, Andrew said that wasn't the priority right now. When I said I was not leaving the apartment, my mother said maybe some space would help until tempers cooled and lawyers clarified things. Lawyers. I still owned 30%. That became their favorite technical mercy. As if being reduced from builder to minority stakeholder by deceit was the sort of detail a reasonable woman should accept if she wanted to prove she wasn't dramatic. The locks got changed that Friday. Andrew said it was about inventory security and reducing volatility. He actually used the word volatility about me. Naomi moved upstairs within the month. The family told people I had stepped back after the broken engagement. Some believed it because it sounded clean. Some believed it because Naomi smiled while she said it. And some believed it because in every family there are people who can only protect their image by agreeing that the person who objects must be unstable. I left with 1 suitcase, my laptop, 2 hard drives, a coat that still smelled like the apartment, and enough rage to ruin me if I didn't find somewhere else to put it. That was the bottom, not the kiss, not the ring. Standing on the sidewalk outside the building, my grandmother built, watching the upstairs light come on in the apartment where I used to work, and realizing my sister was settling herself into my life while the people who should have stopped her were calling it complicated. I could have survived losing a man. What I didn't know how to survive yet was watching my sister sleep above my grandmother's store while I stood outside with no key. For the first few weeks after I left, I lived like somebody who had escaped a fire and was still checking her skin for burns. I slept on a friend's couch in another city, because I couldn't bear to be anywhere I might run into customers with gentle eyes, and the wrong version of my story already loaded in their mouths. I answered only the calls I had to. I blocked Andrew. I blocked Naomi. I left my mother on red more than once, because every message from her sounded like she was reaching toward the idea of healing, without ever walking through the facts of what had been done. Then the first crack showed up. It came in the form of a forwarded email from one of our fabric reps, asking if I wanted to approve revised yardage on a capsule Naomi had announced online as her first house-designed collection. I stared at that email for a long time. Not because I wanted the work. Because Naomi didn't even know which rep to CC. A week later Rosa called. She didn't say much. She never did. She just told me Naomi had sent back a fitted sample 3 times, because she couldn't explain what was wrong with it, only that it didn't look expensive enough. Then Rosa said something that stayed with me for years. "She's wearing your work," she said. "She's not making any of it." I opened my hard drives that night for the first time since I left. Every original sketch was there. Every tech pack, every sourcing sheet, every edit trail, every vendor email with attachments and timestamps and notes in my language, not Naomi's. That mattered. Then the trademark renewal notice came. Not by mail. By email. Because years earlier when Evelyn and I filed the rebrand, I had used my own contact information and never changed the recovery settings. Andrew had renewed the mark under the business, but the recorded assignment chain was sloppy. No clean transfer. No corrected ownership record. Just assumption layered over convenience. That mattered too. From a distance, Naomi and Andrew looked like they were doing fine. 6 months after the bridal shower, they got married. The photos surfaced in waves through mutual friends and old customers, who didn't realize what they were handing me every time they said, "I know this must be weird, but Naomi looks beautiful." She did. That was part of the problem. Beautiful people get more grace while doing ugly things. She wore the diamond in every close-up. Andrew looked pleased with himself in the manner men do, when they mistake successful acquisition for love. The reception was in a hotel ballroom that tried very hard to look timeless. I saw the edge of my grandmother's ring against a champagne flute, and had to close my laptop because my hands started shaking again. But by then something had shifted. The grief was still there. But it wasn't just grief anymore. It had structure. Old customers kept writing me quietly. Some said Naomi was cold when the camera wasn't on. Some said the store still looked like Evelyn Lane but felt wrong now, too rushed, too polished, too eager to upsell. One bride wrote to ask if Naomi's new collection was based on an old sketch she remembered seeing on my desk years earlier. It was. I told her I couldn't discuss internal matters, and then sat in silence for 10 minutes, because there are moments when self-control feels less like virtue and more like a tourniquet. The back-end cracks kept coming. Vendor terms tightened. Returns increased. Their social media got glossier as their product got thinner. That's another pattern people ignore. When a business starts lying to itself, the photography gets better before the numbers do. I didn't strike then. I couldn't have. Even if I wanted to. Revenge fantasies are cheap when you're broke. What I had in that first year wasn't leverage. It was proof that the version of reality Naomi and Andrew were selling was weaker than it looked. I kept every file. I kept every renewal notice. I kept screenshots of every dress that looked a little too much like something I had already designed before I got locked out. And I learned something my grandmother had always known. A lie can look stable for years if the people benefiting from it keep the lights bright enough. But a lie built on bad paperwork is still a lie. I started over in a studio apartment with thin walls and a radiator that clanged all winter like it had personal grudges. I took freelance pattern work first, because it was what I could do, without explaining my life to strangers. Then alterations. Then inventory cleanup for a boutique that had expanded too fast and didn't know why its margins were disappearing. I said yes to jobs that paid late. Jobs that paid badly, jobs that taught me things. That last category mattered most. A woman named Dana Brooks ran a small consulting shop that helped independent retailers get out of the mess they made when they confused growth with discipline. She hired me for a 3-week contract because I understood both product and operations. I stayed because she noticed I read statements the way most people read rooms. Dana had a gift for saying practical things so plainly they felt like slaps. The first time she saw me freeze over a loan worksheet because one of the covenants reminded me of Andrew's language, she tapped the page and said, "You don't beat people like that by crying better than they do. You beat them by understanding the paper they hide behind." That sentence changed the direction of my life. I didn't become a different person overnight. I became more legible to myself. I learned lease structures, debt stacking, cure periods, collateral descriptions, personal guarantees, note sales, special servicing. I learned how businesses deteriorate in private while posting celebration graphics in public. I learned that most owners don't really understand their financing until somebody smarter buys it out from under them. And because I came from product, because I knew what real work looked like, I could see where vanity decisions bled into default long before a lender bothered to say it out loud. All the while, the old wound stayed threaded through the new life. Not in a melodramatic way. In the way pain actually survives. A familiar font on an ad and your body reacts before your thoughts do. A customer mentions a boutique you built and says your sister has really taken it to the next level. And you keep smiling, because dignity and humiliation sometimes occupy the same face. A friend sends you a picture of Naomi hosting a trunk show in the apartment windows that used to frame your midnight work sessions, and you stare at the image long enough to notice she's standing next to a dress whose original file is still saved on your hard drive under a name she never even knew. I didn't spend 4 years in some cinematic tunnel sharpening knives. I paid rent. I rebuilt my credit. I learned how to sleep again. I learned how not to answer the fantasy version of my mother in my head every time the real one sent a message that skipped past accountability and went straight to missing me. I learned how to carry grief without letting it turn me simple. That was the real rebuilding. Not getting stronger. Getting more exact. 2 years in, Dana moved me from cleanup work to lender-side projects because I understood distressed retail better than most of the finance men who thought lipstick margins were beneath them. That's where I started seeing note packages. That's where I learned how debt travels once the original relationship dies. 3 years in, I had enough reputation that people brought me into rooms where owners tried to pretend late payments were temporary weather. 4 years in, a broker circulated a small distressed commercial package with a familiar address in the collateral summary. I knew the building before I opened the full file. The square footage matched the back stairwell in my body before it matched it on paper. I asked for the materials and read them twice that night. Naomi and Andrew had refinanced harder than I thought. They had leveraged the building and the apartment in the name of expansion and visibility. They had layered too much debt onto a business that looked elegant online and unstable everywhere that counted. Sales had softened. Inventory was bloated. Vendor pressure was up. And the SBA-backed loan they thought made them important was 91 days delinquent. 91 days. That number sat in my chest like a key turning. I didn't act emotionally. I ran the structure. The note was discounted because the lender wanted out and the borrowers looked messy. The collateral was better than the operations. The building still mattered. The lease still mattered. The trademark chain was still flawed. And I understood the asset more intimately than anybody else on earth. Dana didn't ask personal questions when I told her I wanted in. She just said, "Do you know the collateral?" I said, "Better than they do." She nodded once. I bought the note through an acquisition company with one quiet partner who trusted my analysis and liked distressed assets more than drama. I put in most of what I had. Not because I was reckless. Because for the first time in 4 years the pain and the leverage were finally facing each other on the same page. Then I reviewed every public filing, every renewal, every amendment, every ugly little seam they had trusted nobody would ever inspect closely. They had never properly cleaned up the trademark chain. They had sold collections built off original files that were still indisputably mine. They had treated my 30% like dead stock after the lockout, and acted like I had voluntarily disappeared when the paper trail showed something uglier. They had used a misrepresented transfer in the middle of a personal implosion to strip me down, and then dared me to look irrational for objecting. That was when revenge stopped being the right word. What I wanted was correction. Correction just happened to hurt. When the loan moved into the part of default where panic starts sounding professional, my mother finally called with a different voice. Not loving. Scared. That mattered too. Fear did what love had refused to do. It made her look directly at consequence. She didn't say Naomi had lied. She didn't say she was sorry for choosing the clean version. She said the bank situation was getting serious. She said lawyers were involved. She said Naomi and Andrew insisted they could fix it if they had more time. I listened. Then I explained very calmly that the bank wasn't the bank anymore. The debt belonged to me. Silence on the other end. Then breathing. Then the first honest sentence my mother had spoken to me in years. What happens now? Not what did they do? Not how could you? What happens now? I told her what happened now depended on whether she wanted to go through a public enforcement process or sign a confidential deed transfer that prevented a more expensive collapse. That sounds cold. It was. Cold is what people call a woman when she finally stops bleeding where they can benefit from it. She signed 3 days later. Not because she chose me over Naomi in some grand redemptive way. Because fear had finally made her admit I was the only person in the family who knew how any of this actually worked. The deed recorded on a Monday morning. I walked into Evelyn Lane that afternoon with the note assignment in one folder, the recorded transfer in another, and 4 years of silence settling into place behind my ribs like a spine. If your own family has ever used your worst day to make you look unreasonable, then you already know this part. The betrayal doesn't end when they take something. It ends when they realize you came back understanding the system better than they ever did. Naomi was in the front showroom when I walked in. She was adjusting a display and talking to a bride in that bright low voice she used when she wanted to seem expensive and comforting at the same time. Andrew was near the register, with a laptop open pretending to be calm in the way finance men do when they're already scanning exits in their head. The bride looked at me first, then Naomi, sensing tension without context. Naomi turned. I watched recognition hit her face in layers. Surprise, annoyance. Then that fast reach for control she had always relied on. Claire, she said as if I had shown up at a funeral underdressed. This isn't a good time. I had imagined that moment more than once, but when it came, I felt almost nothing. Not because I was healed, because I had finally arrived with something stronger than feeling. I looked at the bride and said, "You should give Rosa your number before you go. She's the only person in this building who still knows how to fit a bodice correctly on the first try." The bride glanced at Naomi uncomfortable. Naomi forced a smile and said, "Can you give us a second?" I didn't move. Andrew closed the laptop and came forward. Whatever warmth I once saw in him had been replaced by a sleek kind of impatience. Men like him age strangely when their control starts slipping. They don't look older. They look more expensive, and more frightened at the same time. He said, "If this is personal, take it somewhere else." "It's not personal," I said. "That's the first thing you got wrong." I set the folder on the cutting table my grandmother had used for 30 years. Naomi's eyes dropped to it. That got her attention in a way my face no longer could. Andrew said, "You can't just walk in here." I opened the folder and slid the assignment across the table. "Actually," I said, "I can." He looked down, then back at me. He didn't touch the paper yet. Smart enough to understand paper mattered. Not smart enough to know when it had already ended. Naomi laughed once, brittle and wrong. "What is this supposed to be?" "It's the note," I said. "The one you stopped paying. The one your lender sold. The one my company owns now." Andrew reached for the document. He read faster than Naomi could. That was one of the only satisfying things about the next few seconds. He understood it before she did. I watched him realize how much air had just left the room. "This is a stunt," Naomi said. "You think you can scare us by buying paperwork?" I pulled the second folder out. "This isn't the part that scares you," I said. "This is." I placed the recorded deed on top of the table. Andrew's jaw shifted. Naomi looked between our faces because she still thought confidence was something a prettier woman could win by holding eye contact longer. "No," she said. "Mom would never." I met her gaze. She already did. That landed. Not because my mother had chosen me morally. Because the fantasy that Naomi still controlled every doorway in the family had just cracked in public. Andrew finally found his voice again. "You manipulated her." There it was, the oldest reflex in the room. "Accuse the woman with evidence of doing the thing you've already done." I said I gave her the same thing you never gave me. A document that meant what it said. Naomi stepped closer, then dropping the customer service voice entirely. "You don't get to come in here after 4 years and act like this is still yours. I almost smiled. That line had waited too long for me. I'm not acting, I said. And this isn't about whether it feels like mine. It's about whose name is on the deed, whose company owns the debt, and how long you thought possession would protect you from paperwork. Rosa had come out from the back by then. So had two sales associates, and the bride who was pretending not to listen, while very obviously listening. Naomi hated witnesses when they weren't admiring her. Andrew lowered his voice. Send whatever you think you have through counsel. I already did, I said. You got the notices. You just thought the wrong person was behind them. That was true. I had used the company name, no personal signature, no sentimental tells, just deadlines, amounts due, default language, cure windows. Everything Andrew respected until he realized he was the borrower being described. Naomi looked at him, then really looked at him, and I saw the first flicker of blame pass between them. That was new. That had not existed in the pantry. In the pantry they had been united by appetite. Debt had introduced a more honest kind of love. She said, "Fix this." He snapped back. "I'm trying." And there it was. A marriage exposed fastest not by romance but by default. I leaned one hand on the cutting table and let the silence stretch just enough. Then I said the line I had carried with me from the sidewalk outside that building 4 years earlier. You changed the locks because you thought I was outside the story. Nobody moved. I looked at the key rack by the back office. Then back at them. I'm not outside it, I said. I own the door now. Naomi's face finally changed. Not into guilt. Into fear. That mattered more. She tried the family card next because people always reach for the old weapon first. You would do this to Mom. After everything I said, the amazing thing about that sentence is that you still think I'm the one doing something to her. Andrew gathered the papers and tried to recover ground by sounding practical. There are procedures. Even if the deed is recorded, there are occupancy and business transition issues. You don't get to humiliate us in front of staff and pretend this is professional. I looked around the showroom. At the fittings, the mirrors, the dresses pinned too loosely, because nobody had checked the waistline on the forms. Then I looked back at him. Professional, I said, would have been not using a broken engagement and a hospital room to misrepresent an equity transfer. His face tightened. He knew. He knew exactly where this was headed next. Naomi still thought this moment was the crisis. It wasn't. This was just the power flip. The real damage was waiting in the records. I told them they had until 5 o'clock to surrender keys, access codes, vendor logins, and possession of the apartment. I told them any removal of physical or digital property outside personal clothing, and clearly personal items, would be treated as conversion. I told Andrew to leave the servers alone, because imaging had already been arranged. That last part was half strategy, half theater. It worked anyway. People like Andrew hear the word imaging and start remembering every shortcut they ever took. Naomi's voice went high, then not shrill, just cracked in the place where control used to sit. You can't just erase us. I picked up the folders. No, I said. That was your move. Then I left them standing in the showroom that used to belong to my grandmother, the place they had learned to mistake for a stage. The first time people only start sounding sorry is after the paperwork flips. I want you to notice that. Because what comes out of them then is rarely remorse. It's fear wearing a softer face. By 3 that afternoon, Andrew's attorney had called mine. By 6, Naomi had sent me a 3-line text from a number I had never blocked, because I didn't know she had it. How far are you planning to take this? That question told me everything. Not what did I misunderstand, not can we talk, not I'm sorry. How far are you planning to take this? To the truth, I thought. Then I put my phone down and went to the conference room where the next part was waiting. Vindication sounds emotional when people say it out loud. In practice, it is usually administrative. A table. A stack of exhibits. A bad argument. Losing oxygen in real time. Andrew came in first with counsel, carrying himself like a man who still believed, if he spoke the language of process long enough, he could reduce the whole thing to a dispute among sophisticated parties. Naomi came in second, with a face so carefully composed, it looked painful. My mother came in last, and sat at the far end of the table like she was hoping guilt might count as contribution if she stayed quiet enough. There are moments when you understand that the people who failed you still want credit for suffering under the consequences of their failure. That was one of those moments. Andrew's attorney opened with the predictable story. My personal relationship with Andrew had deteriorated before the wedding. I had voluntarily stepped back from the boutique. The ownership transfer was signed and valid. Naomi had since contributed significantly to the brand and operations. Any challenge now was retaliatory and colored by emotional revisionism. I let him finish. Then I opened my binder. The first exhibit was a text Naomi sent me from the hospital waiting room the day I signed the transfer packet. Just sign the emergency ops papers so vendors don't panic before mom wakes up. This doesn't change your ownership. It just keeps things moving while you breathe. I slid the printout across the table. Then the second text. I know today is awful. We can untangle the rest later. These are temporary. Then the email attachment history on the PDF packet itself. Creation date, 3 days before the bridal shower. Amendment drafted before the pantry. Before the confrontation. Before the wedding was obviously over. Andrew's attorney read that more slowly. Good. Then I placed the operating amendment beside Naomi's texts, describing it as temporary coverage. Fraud by misrepresentation doesn't get prettier because the font is elegant, I said. Nobody answered. I moved to the next stack. Version history from the shared drive showing the transfer packet was assembled under Andrew's account credentials before the bridal shower and revised twice after internal lender comments. Which meant at a minimum he had planned the ownership shift while still showing up at my apartment to taste cake samples and discuss seating charts. Andrew looked at the page and then away from it. That mattered to me more than if he had argued. Because silence is where arrogance goes when proof walks in. Then came the design files. Original sketches with timestamps. Pattern files with my annotations. Vendor development emails going back years. My lawyer laid them out next to marketing materials from Evelyn Lane's post-lockout campaigns. One by one the fantasy collapsed. Not because Naomi lacked taste. Because taste is not authorship. Because curation is not creation. Because a woman can stand in front of somebody else's labor for years and still never become its source. Rosa came in for her statement after lunch. She was not dramatic. Thank God. She was 63, tired, direct, and impossible to cross-examine into performance. She testified that I designed the core silhouettes Naomi later sold as part of the boutique's signature line. She testified Naomi did not know how to run fittings or production without heavy support. She testified that after I was locked out, Naomi repeatedly brought samples back because she could not articulate what was structurally wrong with them. Then Rosa said the exact sentence I had prayed she would say in her own language, not mine. She wears the work better than she makes it. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. That was the first time I believed she was actually feeling any shame at all. The trademark records came next. No properly recorded assignment from me. Renewals filed on the assumption of ownership, not the clean documentation of it. Andrew's attorney tried to soften that by calling it an administrative oversight common in small businesses. I asked him whether he considered swearing a chain of title you had not actually perfected to be an aesthetic issue or a legal one. He did not answer that either. Then I introduced the ledger distributions. That part wasn't poetic, but it was deadly. During the same period they were falling behind on the SBA-backed loan, Naomi and Andrew had continued drawing aggressively from the business, while underinvesting in production quality and vendor repair. Not criminal in itself. Just stupid. The kind of stupid that becomes expensive once the wrong person gets access to your internal books. And I was the wrong person. Or the right one depending on who you asked. My mother finally spoke when the hospital records came out. Not because they proved incapacity. I had never claimed that. They proved context. Post-op sedation, reduced alertness. The same day Naomi used my mother's condition as emotional leverage while telling me the transfer packet was temporary. My mother looked at the text printouts and whispered I didn't know she said that. I looked at her for the first time in hours. You didn't ask, I said. That was as much grace as I had. Naomi's attorney tried one more angle. She argued contribution. Public face. Goodwill. Customer relationships. I let her finish too. Then I turned to Naomi directly. Not to her lawyer. To her. You want credit for making people comfortable long enough to buy what I built, I said. That's not contribution. That's costume jewelry on a real estate closing. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. So I kept going. You didn't build this brand. You wore it. You didn't save this store. You borrowed against it. And the woman you called unstable is the only reason any of this was ever worth owning. That was the line that broke the room. Not because it was cruel. Because everybody there knew it was true. Andrew was the first to shift into settlement language after that. Of course he was. Men like him stop believing in principle the second principle gets expensive. He asked what I wanted. The old me might have answered emotionally. I did not. I wanted full turnover of the apartment and business premises. I wanted acknowledgement of the defective transfer, and a surrender of any claim built on Naomi's misrepresented acquisition. I wanted cessation of use on all design assets traceable to my files unless licensed by me in writing. I wanted the ring. Naomi actually laughed at that part, sharp and bitter. The ring. I looked at her hand. She wasn't wearing it that day. Yes, I said. The ring. My grandmother's diamond does not stay with the woman who used it to mark stolen territory. Andrew said something about gifts and relationship ambiguity. I stopped him. It was given to me, I said. Then weaponized by both of you. If you want to litigate the diamond in open court while discovery opens the rest, we can do that. He shut up. Again. By then everybody knew where this was going. Not because I was louder. Because I had brought the one thing a liar can't outcharm for long. Sequence. Texts. Timestamps. Filings. Files. Witnesses. Distributions. Renewal defects. Document history. Truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it tightens. Sometimes it becomes so specific the people who lied have nowhere left to stand without looking exactly like themselves. The settlement took 2 days to finalize. 2 days. That's how long it took to undo the fantasy once the paperwork walked into the light. Naomi returned the ring through counsel. She did not write a note. That was honest in its way. My mother asked to see me alone before final signatures. We met in a quiet conference room with bad coffee and a fake ficus in the corner. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not fragile, just finally reduced to her actual size without the family mythology around her. She said she had never meant for any of it to happen that way. I believed her. That changed nothing. Intent is the refuge of people who benefit from outcomes they never had the courage to stop. I told her that too, though less elegantly. She cried. I did not. She asked if there was any chance we could be a family again once this was over. That question would have destroyed me 4 years earlier. Now it just made me tired. I said, we can be related. I don't know if we can be a family. Then I stood up. That was the whole meeting. Once the truth is public, and the leverage is yours, this is the part people argue about. Do you stop at taking back what's yours? Do you keep going until the people who erased you feel every inch of what they did? I had enough power left to do either. That was the real test. I took back the store. I took back the apartment. I took back the ring. I took back the name on the work. I did not stay to become the kind of woman who needed to live forever in the scene of her injury. That distinction saved me. The first night I was alone in the apartment again, I stood in the middle of the living room and listened. The place sounded different. Not haunted. Just emptied out of performance. Naomi had changed almost everything she could without understanding what gave the place its shape in the first place. New sconces. Lighter upholstery. Trendier art. The bones were still my grandmother's. The rest felt like somebody had tried to stage intimacy from a catalog. I opened the windows. I took down the abstract print Naomi had hung over the old drafting table. I set my grandmother's ring box on the work surface and left it there while the city dimmed outside. Then I cried. Not because I wanted my old life back. Because I finally understood I didn't. That was the quiet miracle underneath everything. Vindication doesn't restore innocence. It restores perspective. I relaunched Evelyn Lane 6 months later on purpose and at a smaller scale. No fake reinvention. No glossy campaign about returning to roots. I stripped the ready-to-wear noise out of it. Rebuilt appointments, limited production, restored the archive, and turned the front room back into what it always should have been. Precise, warm, and harder to fake. I kept Rosa. I brought in one young tailor who actually wanted to learn. I framed one of my grandmother's handwritten fitting notes near the register. Not as nostalgia, as policy. Listen first, measure twice. Don't flatter what should be corrected. The apartment upstairs became a studio again, but not the same one. That mattered to me. I did not rebuild my old life room by room. I built a truer one on the same foundation. My mother and I speak now in a limited, careful way that would have looked sadder to me before I learned the cost of pretending. She does not have keys. She does not get unstructured access to the books, the apartment, or my interior life. Boundaries look harsh only to people who were counting on your openness to stay irresponsible. Naomi sent one email 8 months after the settlement. Just one. It said she hoped one day I would understand. She had been unhappy for a long time and that people do messy things when they feel unseen. I read it twice. Then I archived it. Because that was the last lie buried under her better vocabulary. Unhappiness does not entitle you to theft. Feeling unseen does not justify rewriting somebody else's life in your name. Andrew tried once through a mutual contact to float the idea that enough time had passed for adult perspective. That phrase almost made me laugh. Adult perspective is exactly what destroyed him. I never responded. The ring sits in a safe now, not on my hand. People sometimes ask me why I don't wear it after everything it costs to get it back. Because getting something back and wanting to display it are not the same thing. Some things are recovered so they can stop being used against you. That's enough. As for the store deed, I keep the first recorded copy in a flat file drawer with the original trademark certificate and one early sketch Evelyn signed off on with a note in the corner. Good, cleaner waste, don't let charm run the room. Sometimes I pull that page out after close and look at her handwriting. Not because I need permission anymore. Because I like knowing she saw the world clearly before I did. There is no fairy tale ending to a story like mine. No sudden sisterly remorse that washes everything clean. No mother collapsing into total clarity. No man realizing too late that he lost the better woman, and somehow making that revelation meaningful. He lost me long before he understood what I was worth. That's his burden, not my romance. Naomi lost access to the role she wanted most. The woman who could slip into my life and be applauded for wearing it well. My mother lost the comfort of believing peace could be purchased with denial. And I lost the version of family I used to protect at my own expense. That was real loss. But it made room for something better than fantasy. It made room for self-respect with a lock on the door. The day we changed the front sign back to the corrected mark, I stayed outside on the sidewalk for a few minutes before going in. Same brick, same windows, same upstairs light. Different woman. 4 years earlier I had stood on that same stretch of concrete with one suitcase and no key, trying to understand how betrayal could feel so administrative. How people who knew your history could still reduce you so quickly, if the lie was tidy enough. This time I stood there with my own keys in my pocket, the deed recorded, the brand corrected, and no need to ask anyone in my family whether I was allowed to call what happened by its right name. That was the victory. Not humiliating Naomi. Not watching Andrew go pale over a covenant he should have read more carefully. Not even getting the apartment back. The victory was that they no longer controlled the language of my life. They didn't get to call me unstable. They didn't get to call theft complicated. They didn't get to call survival abandonment. And they never again got to confuse my silence with weakness. I didn't go back upstairs to become who I had been before. That woman was gone, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. I went back upstairs because that room finally belonged to the woman they couldn't erase. So tell me honestly, if your own sister stole your fiancé and helped take your family business, would you drag her all the way through court, if that's what it took? Or would taking back what was yours be enough? Which wound cuts deeper to you, losing the safe person you thought you'd marry, or losing the work, home, and legacy that held your whole identity together? And once you've won, once the deed is in your hands, and the truth is public, do you forgive because you're free now, or do you keep that door closed forever?